Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. Welcome to the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators 2021 Spring Executive Committee meeting, a two-day event focusing on some of the most pressing issues for the Hispanic community. My name is Kenneth Romero, and I'm the Executive Director of NHCSL. Today's program focuses on broadband, federal infrastructure investments, and Latino communities. How can Congress leverage the infrastructure bill to close the digital divide and benefit unserved and underserved communities, particularly Hispanics and people of color? For this important discussion, we have the great honor to have Federal Communications Commission Acting Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, along with NHCSL President Senator Daniel Ivy Soto. Mr. President?
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I do believe we have the interview with the Chair, Rosenworcel, that we're going to go to. And then after that, we're going to be joined for a discussion on how to leverage the federal broadband legislation that's being discussed into our communities.
Chair Rosenworcel, you recently spoke at a meeting of the Hispanic Technology and Telecom Partnership and said that one of your goals was to promote all positive initiatives of tech equity coming from state legislatures. Are there any specific policies on tech equity that you think states should be pursuing at this point?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the caucus having me here today to talk about how we can improve digital equity and make sure broadband reaches everyone, everywhere. I said what I did to HTTP because I think if digital equity isn't your main thing, you have to realize it's a foundation for everything. Going forward in our economy and in civic life, if you have access to the internet and all it affords, there's a whole range of things that you're going to be able to do in your community, in your state, and in your life. And we need to figure out how to make sure that reaches everyone everywhere. And of course, we can do a lot of things in Washington, but one of the more powerful things is to recognize that state and local actors really know what's going on in their own backyards and can make meaningful difference when it comes to digital equity and local legislative and regulatory initiatives. For starters, lots of those initiatives that involve data are powerful, figuring out who's connected and who's not. In the communities where you live, you know, the odds are you're going to do it better than a whole bunch of folks in Washington. So we recommend that you do some counting and start assessing where service is and is not. In addition, I think we're going to need two different types of initiatives to help close the digital divide. The first is funding to help extend the reach of broadband infrastructure to places where it's not present, especially in rural communities. And then we're going to need initiatives to help figure out how we get people online and adopt service if they're struggling with affordability or digital literacy. And having all those kind of initiatives at the federal, state, and local level, I think that's how we're going to solve the digital divide.
So one of the things we saw this last year is having broadband or having access to the internet and having sufficient speed and bandwidth are two completely separate things. So over the next 5 to 10 years, how do you define a sufficient broadband speed and the investment that it's going to take to get there?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, but you know, the thing about technology is it's always going to amaze you and confound you and will change faster than any of us can predict. And thinking we all need a little humility and should acknowledge that. But I can say this, the last administration left us with a broadband speed that is our standard today in the United States of 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. And coming out of this pandemic, when we have been asked to go online for work, for school, for healthcare and more, I think it's time for us to be more ambitious and have a broadband standard that's higher. So I hope to be able to work with my colleagues going forward to do that. I've already taken note that the Department of Commerce and Department of Treasury with their broadband programs have required at least 100 megabits downstream and higher upstream speeds as well. I think we have to start having bigger standards if we want to get more audacious things done. And one of the things I hope is that we can start aligning those standards in the federal government and then work with our state counterparts to also make sure that, you know, we dream big instead of dream small.
No, I think that's fabulous. And one of the things that we did that really got a lot of people, helped to get a lot of people online, was, of course, providing a temporary subsidy for broadband. But those subsidies are going to be running out. And what options will people have as those subsidies run out, so we can make sure that we keep them online?
This is such a good point. First, let me just start by noting this. Right now, the FCC is running a program called the Emergency Broadband Benefit. It's our nation's largest ever broadband affordability program. We've never had anything like this before. And it helps households that are low income get online by supporting them with $50 a month for broadband, and that number goes up to $75 a month on tribal land. Plus, there are some discounts off a computer or laptop in many cases. We've got more than 1,000 broadband providers nationwide participating, and I recommend that state legislators get the word out, because there's a lot of people who could get connected with this discount. Now, the challenge is that this discount is funded by a $3.2 billion appropriation. And like you said, when those dollars run out, the question is what happens next? It's my hope that we do a good job with this program, we connect more people in more places, and then we get to turn to Congress and say, we need a long-term plan for broadband affordability in the United States. And let's learn from this program, this down payment on getting so many more households connected, and figure out how to shape that program going forward. We're already having conversations like that with Congress, because I think there is more interest than ever in figuring out how to get those households that don't have a reliable and consistent internet connection online permanently.
And in terms of those households, you know, I think to a large degree, and so I come from New Mexico, and we are the 5th largest state geographically, but we are one of the smaller states in terms of population. Mm-hmm. And so I know from the work that I've done in New Mexico, and my colleagues in the legislature have done in New Mexico, what a lot of the challenges are of trying to deploy broadband out to places where it's just not economically feasible to do the build out. Right? And so it seems to me that we're dealing first with people who live in rural communities that have almost no real connectivity at all. Then we've got people who migrate between rural communities. Many of these being farm workers, their families, but you've also got people they're outside of the rural areas, even beyond that to a large degree, mm-hmm. right? And then we've got people in the urban areas that they either don't have access to the best speeds, or it's a question of the overall pipe to be able to serve all the people in the community, so that if everybody's on at the same time, you end up with a very choppy connection. And so how do we from the federal level, and I appreciate your confidence at the state level, for us mm-hmm. to find a way to try to reach all those different communities, you know, but you know, one of the things, for example, that I tried to do a few years ago was to leverage the E-rate dollars mm-hmm. in order to use schools and libraries throughout the state, more in the urban areas, but also present in the rural areas, to get a statewide broadband network. And even doing that has been challenging. Mm-hmm. How do we get to all the different communities?
You know, even your question demonstrates it, that like, this is not a simple problem. Once you start evaluating all these nuances in broadband deployment, you start to recognize that you're going to have areas that are totally unserved. We need to quantify them. You have areas that are underserved. We need to quantify them. And then you also have adoption and affordability problems that are sometimes in areas that have service, but households that aren't getting online. And if this was an easy set of problems to solve, we would have done it by now. Instead, we're going to have to use a really big mix of solutions to make it happen. So we're going to have more programs in Washington. If you're following Congress, you know, we're going to have a big new infrastructure proposal. There are already programs at the FCC and the Universal Service Fund. We have a telemedicine fund that helps with telehealth and broadband. We have the E-rate fund, which helps extend broadband to our nation's schools and libraries and provides more support in communities with higher percentages of students on the free and reduced lunch program. We also have new programs that are coming out of the Department of Commerce to connect rural areas and tribal areas. And we've got new programs for state and local governments at the Department of Treasury, as well as longstanding programs at the Department of Agriculture, the Rural Utility Service. And if you feel like that's a lot, I feel like even more are coming your way. So the challenge for a lot of state actors is to figure out how to find the right program and take advantage of it. Because the truth is, not one of them is going to solve our problem on its own. We're going to need all of them. And we're also going to have to start figuring out, better than we ever have before, how federal and state and local actors work together. I think if we act like this is just a problem we're going to solve in Washington with Washington dollars, we're missing the fact that there are a whole bunch of officials who know better than folks in Washington what's happening in their own backyard. And one of the things I want to do is figure out how we can really work together on this and not just make decisions without spending some time with local and state folks who can tell us what's really going on. So that's a long-winded way of saying we're going to need a lot of different programs, a lot of different technologies, and we're going to have to build a lot stronger partnerships.
Well, and you know, one of the real polemics that we have at the local level is how much do we do in terms of fiber in the ground? How much do we do in terms of wireless deployments? Mm-hmm. And you know, and certainly for Latinos, we more than any other group use wireless as our primary means of accessing the internet.
That's true. Across the board, Spanish-speaking households over-index on mobile use for internet service like no other demographic. And so the challenge is, how do I bring you from just using that device and the consumption opportunities associated with it and move these households to being creators, right? Because when you get a really fat broadband pipe into your home, we expand the range of things you can do and expand the ways you can participate in civic and commercial life. And so that's why one of the things we really want to get done at the FCC right now is figure out how we can get 100% of our households connected to broadband, not just mobile broadband, but really high-speed broadband, because I think that there's a lot of economic opportunity that will follow from that.
So what are they, so within that, right? I mean, because that's been not just a polemic at the a consideration at the state level, but also at the FCC, and in terms of how to balance all of those issues, and I know that that's something that you've struggled with, and so, you know, what is, as we are working to do that, right? And certainly as you guys are at the FCC deploying the $7+ billion in the emergency connectivity fund to provide that those connections specifically for students that are caught in the homework gap. You know, how do we do that in a way where we do provide equity within the Latino community and other communities of color?
So I appreciate you brought up the Emergency Connectivity Fund. That's more than $7 billion to help address our nation's homework gap. And to the uninitiated, I always describe the homework gap like this. When I was growing up, if I wanted to do my nightly schoolwork, it took paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. And that last one was, of course, the hard part. Now you need internet access. We all know that. We knew it before the pandemic. But we also knew that 1 in 3 households in this country still don't subscribe to broadband, and that there are 17 million kids that live in those households who are locked out of the virtual classroom during this pandemic. And you know who they are. They're disproportionately Black and brown children. They're disproportionately Latino. They're Black, they're American Indian and Alaska Natives. They are households we need to bring into this economy and make sure that their education is as robust as possible. So one of the ways to address the digital divide is to think about how to reach those students so that they don't fall into a homework gap, so they don't have to slide into a booth at a fast food restaurant to do their nightly schoolwork with a borrowed laptop. So for the first time ever, we have a big homework gap fund. It's more than $7 billion. At the end of June, we're going to open a window for schools and libraries across the country to apply. So if you live in a community that has traditionally relied on E-rate dollars, which helps support connectivity to the classroom, the new thing about this program is it will help support connectivity to the student at home. And I think that's extraordinarily powerful, especially for students who might live in a household where their parents don't speak English, where getting their parents to sign up for a monthly plan for high-speed service might be a bridge too far or difficult, where you've got immigration, or parents who are immigrants. My mother grew up in a house where her parents were immigrants, and she described everything she had to do for her education. So the idea with this homework gap is that the schools can help get those students connected at home. And in some cases, that'll be a Wi-Fi hotspot. In some cases, that'll be actually a modem and getting them connected to a facility at home. But the bottom line is, if we use the $7 billion, we can help make a meaningful dent in the homework gap and get those kids the opportunities they deserve. And coming out of this pandemic, where we moved education online, let's figure out how no student is shut out of the virtual classroom or doing their nightly schoolwork again. I think it's within our power to fix this. And this $7 billion homework gap is a great way to start. I'm very proud that the FCC is starting this now. I wish we did it at the beginning of the pandemic, but I think we're going to do some meaningful good, because we have come to recognize in this country that every student's going to need that paper, a pencil, a textbook, but they're also going to need internet access if they succeed.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and being willing to have a conversation about these issues, which are so important to our communities. Jessica Rosenworcel.
You got it. Don't worry. Thank you for having me. And thank you to the caucus for being interested in these issues. Let this be the start of our conversation. Always happy to help.
No, I look forward to it. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you, and I look forward to you becoming the permanent chair of the FCC.
Take care.
Thank you to Chairwoman Rosenworcel. When it comes to broadband, the pandemic made three things clear. First, broadband is a vital service in today's interconnected world. Second, US broadband networks held up pretty well as much of the nation transitioned to working and learning from home. And third, the digital divide is very real, deep, and difficult to bridge. Federal policymakers are currently debating federal infrastructure legislation, including funding mechanisms for making broadband more affordable for low-income households and more widely available in rural areas where the economics of deploying networks are challenging at best. To explain and explore the costs, policy benefits, and risks associated with closing the digital divide for low-income, rural, and communities of color, we have today Brenda Victoria Castillo, President and CEO of the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Ana Gomez, Chair of the FCC Advisory Committee on Diversity and Digital Empowerment, Joy Chaney, Executive Director of the Washington Bureau for the National Urban League, and Alejandro Roark, Executive Director of HTTP. I'll turn the microphone over to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. So let me begin this panel discussion here with Joy Chaney. And Joy, you recently told House appropriators regarding broadband that we have to be careful not to fall into the old traps of aggressively solving for one community's problem, a community that is racially diverse but predominantly white, while relying on hope and market principles to solve for another community's problem, a community that is also racially diverse but disproportionately composed of people of color and those earning lower incomes. How do we avoid that?
Well, first of all, Mr. President, thank you so much for having me here. This is exciting to be here. One of the great things about the Urban League, everyone knows that we focus on African-American communities, but we also focus on Latinx communities as well and other communities of color. And so it is a real honor to be here speaking on behalf of the League and to tell you a little bit about our Latimer plan. And thank you to all my co-panelists. Yes, I did say that. And I said it and I meant it, and I also repeated it in some articles later on. And what it means is that we have two problems, and the chairwoman really identified them. She said we got an availability problem, but we also have an adoption problem, which focuses on affordability as well as digital literacy, or the Urban League, we like to say digital empowerment. And how we solve that is we have to invest, not necessarily equally, but equitably in solving both of those issues. It is well known that we have an availability problem, and we are now understanding more that rural America is diverse, right? And has many Latinx and many African Americans. But now we also need to have it as commonly understood that when you're looking at new numbers, not percentages, but numbers, the vast majority of people have broadband all around them, but they simply cannot access them for all the reasons that the chairwoman identified. They either can't afford or the broadband, or they don't understand how to access it. So we believe there have to be investments in a permanent broadband benefit that takes what we've learned from the emergency broadband benefit and Lifeline and other programs, and expands it and puts it to something that is permanent and that can be relied upon. How we pay for it, always a question. What level of internet is required, always a question. And I know we're going to get to that today, but that there is a universal commitment to saying this is not a, nicety. What the pandemic has taught us is that having broadband in the home is as essential as having running water, having indoor plumbing, at least in our view, and I know in the view of many others, and electricity. And so seeing that it's that essential, it can't be sporadic or depending on who's in public office. And let me also specifically say the most controversial part of my thing is that I said, not relying on market principles. So often in this debate, what we've heard folks say is that, competition will drive down costs. That's all you need. You don't need a permanent broadband benefit. And we know that those are well-meaning ideas. And that certainly competition does drive down costs for many, including probably all the folks here. Many of us might pay less, but we're not the ones who need the help. It's the people who really cannot afford any level of cost, or certainly not the cost that we'd be talking about here. They wouldn't be as helped by that, or it would take a very long time. And we know that they don't have that time. They need to have access just as we don't have that time. Most of us are at home. Or if we're not at home, we've certainly been at home in the last couple of months. Everyone, all Americans, all people who live in this country deserve that kind of access. So that's what I've meant, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So let me pivot over to Ana Gomez. You're an expert in the urban-rural tribal divide on broadband. And so based upon the comments that Joy just made, as well as Chairwoman Rosenworcel's comments, how do we best make sure that all of these communities are served?
Thank you again for inviting me to speak today. I think Chairwoman Rosenworcel and Joy both did a very good job of talking about the digital divide and what causes it. For too long, we have been focusing almost entirely on deployment, funding the actual deployment of broadband, which is important. But I completely agree that you can't just have an attitude of if you build it, they will come. If you have enough competition, they will come. Universal service, which is this decades-long program, both in the private sector and then at the FCC, sprang out of the recognition that the market alone is not going to solve certain societal needs. And so, Chairwoman Rosenworcel did a really good job of talking about all the various programs that are available at the FCC, at the Department of Commerce, at the Department of Treasury. And I think that one of the lessons that we have learned is it really is an all hands on deck exercise. It can't be just run out of the federal agencies. We need to have everyone working together, communities working together, states and localities working together. And so if there is one thing that I would recommend to the folks that are participating today, it is to go back and make sure that you have the capacity within your states to coordinate, manage all of these multiple programs. We've got billions and billions and billions of dollars that are being dedicated, but you really need to make sure that you have somebody coordinating it at the state level and at the local level to make sure that you can take advantage of all of those programs. So that would be one of my messages that comes out of listening to both Joy and to the Chairwoman Rosenworcel. Completely agree, the digital divide is not an issue that can be solved with a single solution. There are so many causes and they're well documented. Sometimes it's affordability, as we talked about. Sometimes it's lack of digital skills. Sometimes it's lack of deployment. So again, that is why I think this capacity building is so very important. One of my past lives was as at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration out of the Department of Commerce. They have a couple of the grant programs that Chairwoman Rosenworcel mentioned, the Tribal Grants Program, the Rural Grants Program, but they also have a program in which they help coordinate all federal agencies that have broadband programs, as well as states and localities. And so I would encourage people to see them as a resource and to participate in some of those coordinating bodies. I also completely agree with the chairwoman when she talked about the importance of data. Data are important, and being able to pinpoint exactly where you need to provide those resources and why the resources are needed is going to be very important over the next year. And understanding the different communities and what their needs are particularly important. Digital literacy, as we talked about, which, as you mentioned, Joy mentioned, she prefers to call it digital empowerment. Some other people refer to it more as digital skills. Whatever it's talked about is extremely important, because we need to have people understand how to best use it. And that's not just consumers, because it's important that consumers use it, it's also for government services, how to best maximize the reach of a government service and make sure that it's actually available to all of the citizens. This is where digital equity does, in fact, very much come in, and it's something that you need to be very intentional about. I guess trying to see my notes here, if there was anything else I wanted to say in particular. I think I've touched on everything that I wanted to touch on. So happy to answer any questions. And again, thank you for having me.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll circle back around to you if you remember something else as well. I do want to bring in both Brenda Castillo and Alejandro Roark into the conversation. Brenda and Alejandro, both of your organizations have been very vocal about the emergency broadband benefit. Both of you want to make it permanent. Why is that so important to you, and how should it be funded? What level should it be funded at? Also, while you're at it, if you don't mind cueing everybody in on what the Broadband Equity for All Coalition is as well.
Thank you, President. The National Hispanic Media Coalition was among the civil rights organization groups that pushed and helped design the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. When the pandemic hit, we immediately worried about our community, but we knew that the digital divide already existed before the pandemic. While we definitely appreciate the EBB, we know that it's a temporary solution for a long-term program. With more than 1 million people enrolled across the country very quickly, we expect millions more to sign up. While funds remain, we know once those funds run out, these consumers will go back to struggling to pay for their internet service at home. That's why we would like to see this evolve into a permanent subsidy solution. More than 1/3 of Latinx households didn't have access to the internet at home before the pandemic. So while the digital divide is exacerbated by the pandemic, it existed long before we knew that coronavirus and will last long before after it. You know, why is it so important to our community? Well, you know, Latinos like myself, we're not born into wealth. We don't have generational wealth, at least in my personal story. So my grandfather had an elementary school education. My father had a high school education. I got a college education, and next year my son will receive his master's. So that's how Latinos move up in the US of A, education. And by not having internet access means that we are not able to have the education that we deserve like every other human being. So that is why it's so important to our Latino community. As far as what's the best price point and where that funding comes from, those are excellent questions and ones that we're, mulling over right now. We're hoping to see data. Anna talked about data and how important that is. We're looking forward to seeing the data from the EBB program about how people are using the benefit, including what their overall average price point is and the plans that they're using to benefit this discount. That will help us really figure out what a long-term subsidy looks like. It's a three-prong. You need the equipment, you need affordable broadband access, and then there's the digital literacy or digital empowerment. So, and then now in regards to Broadband Equity for All, the group BEA, it's a coalition made up of about 51 diverse group organizations, including ISPs, that focus on advocating for the forthcoming infrastructure plan to include a permanent subsidy to ensure access to broadband for low-income communities. NHMC is one of those members. BEA was inspired by the earlier April letter to Congress from diverse group organizations calling for the permanent subsidy. Some of our activities are really, we plan to send letters to policymakers, meet with policymakers. There's a communication plan, but we've only met once. And it was more of an introduction. So looking forward to the next meeting where we're going to dig down a little deeper. Alejandro?
And as a matter of fact, actually, the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators is also a member of that same coalition.
As is the National Urban League.
There you go. Alejandro.
Yeah, so thank you, Senator Ivy Soto, and to our friends at NHCSL for including this topic as a part of your spring meeting. I think that to kind of echo what's been said today, throughout the course of the global health crisis, we all saw the heartbreaking pictures of Latina students attempting to do their homework in a Taco Bell parking lot. We saw our friends and our family members in long lines at unemployment offices as Latinos face record job losses, specifically Latino women, many of whom work in the service industry and whose jobs disappeared overnight. And we are now seeing the low vaccination rates within our community, perhaps because the primary way that anyone could get a vaccine in the early stages was by making an appointment online through the often outdated government websites. Each of these scenarios tell the story of what happens when Latino households don't have access to reliable, high-speed internet at home. Those two little girls could have continued their classwork at home. The people that had to wait in the long lines and expose themselves unnecessarily to the virus could have enrolled for unemployment benefits online and used the internet as a resource to learn new skills or find another job in their area. And Latino households with an internet connection could have much easier access to credible information about the vaccine or to be able to navigate the sometimes complicated government websites that would have allowed them to make an appointment. In the United States, only 65% of Latino households have an at-home broadband connection compared to 80% of white households. And the number one most cited reason for not having an at-home subscription is the price. In fact, household annual income is directly correlated to whether or not a home has broadband. Pew Research recently found that households that earn $50,000 or less are even less likely to have a broadband connection at home. And I think that it's important for us to acknowledge and to kind of note that the median household income for Hispanic households across the country is $56,000 a year. The emergency broadband benefit directly addresses the main barrier to adoption that is cited most by Latino communities and creates an on-ramp to not just digital opportunity, but it helps Latino families reach new possibilities. new possibilities in education, in healthcare and employment, which is why HCTP created the EBB Para Mí National Public Awareness Campaign in partnership with national Latino organizations to ensure that our community knows about the program and is supported through every part of the enrollment process and provides them with guidance for how to select an internet service provider or a service plan that meets their family's needs and their budget in the long run. I think that our country and our state and local communities not only need to have a long-term infrastructure plan to meet the connectivity needs of cost-sensitive consumers, but we also need a short-term strategy like the EBB so that Latino households can get the help that they need to connect today. And that is what the emergency broadband benefit does. It provides immediate relief today and has already demonstrated the urgent need for this type of assistance, especially for historically disadvantaged households. As far as funding is concerned, many people have advocated, there's lots of different possibilities. Some have proposed that maybe it be funded through spectrum auctions and those revenues be held in a trust, that would provide dividends. Others propose a similar funding structure as a Lifeline program. But I think that with the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, we really can sit and rethink and use, the data that we're going to get from the program, which the FCC is tracking, to make the internet accessible and affordable to low-income families, and really think about this opportunity to grow the funding pot and bring together diverse stakeholders within the internet ecosystem, not just internet service providers, who have also been making a lot of money online, and maybe establish a funding mechanism where everyone is chipping in, because everyone, we all benefit when every person is connected online. So I think that is the main thing that I think you're seeing a lot of the people on the panel talk about today is the need for collaborative action. And that's, I think, what we are doing at HCTP to ensure that we're bringing stakeholders together, that we're getting information out to our communities. And I think that local elected officials and local leaders have a very important voice and a stake in determining how and where broadband infrastructure is deployed. So thank you again.
So along those lines, though, Alejandro and Brenda as well, the president has said that he believes continually providing subsidies to cover the cost of overpriced internet service is not the right long-term solution for either consumers or for taxpayers. And he has stated that he believes that we pay too much for internet and wants Congress to find a solution to reduce internet prices for all Americans. Is there such a solution, or are permanent subsidies at this point really the right answer? Let me start with Alejandro, and then I'll go back to Brenda.
Perfect. So I think that today, this moment, is a unique opportunity to use, like Acting Chair Rosenworcel said, to use every tool in our toolbox to connect every home. Whenever that we end up with government on one side and industry on another side, or we impose a very specific solution and expect it to work for every community, we all lose. Every community has a different terrain, different demographics, varying funding capacity. And I think if our shared goal is to make broadband accessible and affordable to everyone, regardless of race, of income, or zip code, then we need to understand first what resources are available in our community, understand the depth of the divide, and only then can we really kind of be able to, when we're able to clearly articulate that, then can we bring everybody to the table to establish, a statewide broadband plan that not only addresses affordability, right, but or like Joy said, it also addresses access and adoption and digital preparedness through culturally inclusive digital skills training. When it comes to meeting the needs of our communities, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. In some areas, it might make sense to establish, a municipal broadband network or a co-op. In other places, as we talk about critical infrastructure, in states, I think that states are able to lead in a way that they're able to connect their citizens to ensure that they reap the benefits and the economic output that comes from being connected. I know in New Mexico, for example, you have a statewide office of broadband where you're prioritizing, mapping and planning and capacity building where needed. In April, you established the Office of Broadband Access and Expansion to kind of centralize and help coordinate broadband activities across kind of state government agencies, local government bodies, tribal government organizations, and internet service providers. in order to develop, a broadband strategic plan and an operational plan to guide expansion for New Mexico. So when I think of critical infrastructure, I think of the importance of establishing statewide offices with digital equity officers or a statewide broadband officer who understand the current state of its broadband infrastructure and engages diverse stakeholders, members of historically excluded communities, along with policymakers and industry leaders to carve a path forward that will stretch taxpayer dollars in a way that is efficient and that connects as many people as possible, as soon as possible. And we all know that there are many factors that contribute to the current price of broadband, and I think the state and local government plays an important role in determining how easy or how difficult it is for broadband providers to expand in your communities. Like I mentioned earlier, when we use every tool in our toolbox to achieve universal access, it really requires us to consider the role that competition plays, the role that local government plays throughout their permitting process and through their internal capacity to make thoughtful decisions about their unique needs and how to best achieve your connectivity goals, because it really is a multidimensional problem that requires action on all fronts. And I think that the Biden administration is trying to be innovative and is open and flexible to try new ideas and new approaches, like establishing the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is essential and I think is meeting a very critical need. And I think that the Biden administration is doing its part to make funding available to explore new solutions. And now it really is up to us to figure out how to make the most of those dollars and ensure that the equity and establishing a baseline of access is guiding the way that we make those decisions.
Let me bring Brenda into this conversation.
Yes. For NHMC, we don't think it's an either or choice. President Biden is correct. People in this country pay way too much for their internet bill when you compare it to the rest of the world. We agree that more needs to be done to lower the prices for everyone, but this is a long-term solution that depends a lot on unsure things, including the fact that the FCC, the agency that would be enforcing these new regulations, it's not fully staffed yet, in leadership yet, and still awaits a nomination from the White House. There is a seat open, and that needs to be filled with a Latinx. I mean, for 2 decades, we have not had representation on the FCC. I think Alejandro says we need a voice. We need a voice in the FCC because they're making decisions for our community. Shifting the pricing scheme in the broadband market will take years. And in the meantime, people are still struggling to pay their internet bill. So for NHMC, this means that we need both solutions to move forward. We need to help people to pay their internet now and while prices are still high, because we need access to the internet to achieve racial justice and equity in this country, while also looking for more affordable market overall in the future. When our children are not receiving an education, it's a domino effect. They're not going to get it, they're not going to do well in getting into the test to get into college. Don't go to college. They're going to accept low-paying jobs. Maybe those low-paying jobs is not going to have insurance. And then how are they going to afford for the American dream to buy their own home? So this is a domino effect on our community, and we need to make sure that we have a voice on the FCC.
Actually, I think the last Latina who was on the FCC was Gloria Tristani,
right?
Who was from New Mexico, actually.
2 decades ago.
That's right. It was quite some time ago, unfortunately. Joy, the National Urban League has also proposed what is called the Lewis-Latimer Plan for Digital Equity and Inclusion. What is this plan, and what are the implementation steps to be able to get there?
Well, I'm going to get to the plan, but right after I say yes, yes, yes to what Alejandro and Brenda and Anna said before me, this is exactly what I meant by our quote. We absolutely must, in this moment where we are committed to making a generational investment that's going to change how we live our lives and ensure a prosperous future where we can all take advantage of the American dream. We can't do that for one community and not do it for another. And we can make changes in the future. It's always too high. We want prices lowered. And to any ISP who's out there, we are committed to that. right? We're committed to that. Any company that's out there, we're committed to that, and we'll be pushing that, and we talk about it in our plan. But we also can't miss the opportunity to take care of people today. So that is what the Lewis-Latimer plan does. It says we want to look at all of these solutions. It's not one size fits all. It's not one thing and then not the other. It's all of the above. We've been talking about closing the digital divide for a very long time. We put together the Lewis-Latimer plan because we could see at the beginning of the pandemic that this was a moment for our nation where the third spaces that people had gone to try to get broadband went away just like that overnight. And they shouldn't have had to go there anyway, right? They should have had it in their home. And so we were committed to having a plan that didn't just focus on one element, that really brought all the things together. So we gathered people who've been writing about these issues, for decades, right? Who've been talking about the digital divide before anyone else was. And we had them write different sections of this. And if you are out there and you contributed to that section, thank you. And we brought together industry, private industry. Thank you for their investment in it. We brought together state and local actors. We brought together policymakers. And ultimately what we did was we addressed 4 things in our plan. Availability, which we've talked about. We talked about adoption, right? Affordability, as well as closing digital literacy gaps. But then third, we talked about something else that we've been talking about today, utilization, making sure that the government, federal, state, and local, are actually using the internet in a way that is useful for the end user, especially those communities of color who are most likely to be interacting with the government at the federal, state, and local level. And that there need to be investments in, workforce development and making sure that people aren't standing in line to get unemployment benefits and other types of interventions in terms of workforce. There needed to be greater utilization in terms of healthcare, and obviously greater utilization in terms of education. And then the 4th thing that we focused on in the Latimer plan was the thing that I think Urban League is also so known for, that is closing economic opportunity gaps. We want to make sure that Latinx, African American, and other underserved populations are actually benefiting from this digital boom that we're all about to experience. And that means from jobs, frontline jobs, to contracts for small businesses who may be engaging in broadband expansion and availability, to ensuring that we have board of directors who look like everyone on the call today, to ensure that we have, and also ownership as well. It won't be enough if we just have broadband. We're getting more than that out of this prospect. And so we talked about all 4 of those things, and we have solutions, and someone was kind enough to include our Latimer plan, a link to it in the chat. And I really hope that you take a look at it. It's long, but it really is comprehensive. And I think there are solutions in there that, and we have some solutions. If this doesn't work, you can try this thing. If ultimately a permanent broadband benefit doesn't happen, we have some solutions in there we call Lifeline Plus that are in there as an alternative. We talk about, sure, there are, we don't want any limitations, anything saying, well, you can't do this. I know there's a lot of conversation about whether municipalities should get involved. That has to be a choice that a locality makes, but we're not putting any blocks on it today. We do want stronger speeds. However, we want to make sure that we get people who don't have anything first. And if we can do that, and we can increase the speeds in some communities, and we can ensure that low-income people who live in urban areas are able to get broadband access, great, great, great. We want all of those things. But it can't just be, someone gets better internet and everyone else, competition. Wait and see how it turns out. That is unacceptable. That's what we mean in the Latimer plan, and I commend it to your reading. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Anna, the Latimer plan does discuss availability, adoption, access, utilization, so you chair the FCC Advisory Committee on Diversity and Digital Empowerment. What is the feasibility of the Latimer plan, as well as what other broadband adoption challenges you think there are that we haven't not addressed today that we just need to touch on so that people are aware of them in their states?
Well, I do believe it's feasible, but it requires dedicated resources and intentionality. There is a line in the Latimer plan that jumped out at me. It says, achieving digital equity and inclusion requires a sustained, systemic, and appropriately resourced effort that is highly reliant on intergovernmental coordination and collaboration. I think that is such a nice summation of everything that we have talked about today. Every one of our speakers has talked about this. And I also commend the Latimer plan for everyone to read it. It has a very good executive summary. You can start with that and then dig into the areas you really want to. As you mentioned, I do chair the Advisory Committee on Diversity and Digital Empowerment at the FCC. The committee is looking at 3 general areas. What we call digital empowerment and inclusion, which is largely broadband, but also, touching a little bit on what Joy talked about, making sure that there are opportunities for all, including small, diverse businesses in the tech sector. Diversity in the tech sector, which is basically coming up with best practices and recommendations for ways to increase diversity in the tech sector. And then finally, Joy talked about ownership. We have a working group that's also looking at access to capital for broadcasters, and we're putting out a lot of information on ways to access capital and some recommendations on ways to improve diverse ownership of broadcasters. On broadband, this is not something we've really talked about, but one of the key focuses of the committee was looking at the crucial role played by public libraries in fostering digital inclusion and digital readiness, particularly when elementary and secondary schools, as well as colleges and universities, were shuttered and forced to deliver services remotely during the pandemic. The committee is looking at ways to support the libraries in their mission, particularly as they face considerable resource and budget constraints that hamper their ability to fully deliver the benefits of digital adoption to the communities they serve, whether they're urban, rural, low, middle income, or tribal. So the committee is going to be providing recommendations on ways to support libraries in general and tribal libraries in particular. They are not substitutions for how important it is to get broadband at home, but they are extremely important resources to the community, especially when it comes to their digital readiness program. So I would commend all of you to make sure that your libraries are well supported. Our final meeting of the Diversity and Digital Empowerment Committee is on June 24th, and we will be presenting all of our recommendations. So I look forward to that, and it's a very active committee. Chairwoman Rosenworcel and actually all FCC commissioners have been very supportive of the work of the committee. And I'm hoping that the FCC will recharter the committee after this one.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We had optimistically hoped to be able to have questions from people who are logged in. However, we've had such a comprehensive discussion. Unfortunately, we have run the time that we had allotted to us. So I do want to thank each of you for having been here with us today. Ana Gomez, Joy Chaney, Alejandro Roark, Brenda Castillo, as well as Acting Chair Jessica Rosenworcel for having made herself available for an interview on this issue as well. This is really one of the most crucial infrastructure and economic and educational access equity issues that we have of our day. And so much of it is being passed down to the state level that it is important for us to be having these conversations between the federal thought thinkers and the state actors so that we can make sure that we do this right. We also look forward to having everybody who is logged in joining us tomorrow, Friday, for our sessions on the reopening of schools, where we will be featuring the United States Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, as well as the President of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, and then we will also then be discussing election issues, and we'll be having an interview with Stacey Abrams at that time. So please log back in tomorrow and join us for those two policy sessions as well. With that, thank you all very much. Goodbye.